Fear and Trembling is often treated as Kierkegaard's most disturbing work, and for good reason. It places the individual in direct conflict with the ethical order and asks whether faith can demand something that ethics itself must condemn. At the center of the text stands a single unsettling figure, Abraham, commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. Kierkegaard does not present this story as a moral lesson, he presents it as a problem. If ethics is universal, then Abraham is a murderer. If ethics is the highest authority, then Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac cannot be justified under any circumstances. And yet the biblical tradition calls Abraham the father of faith. Kierkegaard forces us to confront this contradiction without softening it. This is why Fear and Trembling is written under a pseudonym. The book does not offer doctrine, it stages an existential confrontation. Kierkegaard wants the reader to feel the tension rather than resolve it prematurely. The text refuses comfort and explanation. It insists that something irreducible is at stake. The key claim Kierkegaard introduces is the teleological suspension of the ethical. This phrase is often misunderstood. Kierkegaard is not claiming that ethics can be casually ignored, nor is he arguing that individuals are free to justify immoral acts by appealing to private belief. He is making a far narrower and more dangerous claim, that faith, in its purest form, may place the individual in absolute relation to the absolute. In such a case, ethics is not abolished, it is suspended. Suspension does not mean rejection. It means that ethics, which normally governs all human action, is temporarily overridden by a higher telos or purpose. That purpose cannot be mediated, explained, or justified publicly. It is accessible only to the individual who stands before God. This is what makes Abraham terrifying. He cannot explain himself. He cannot justify his action ethically. He cannot appeal to universal principles. From the outside, he appears silent, cruel, and irrational. Kierkegaard insists that this silence is not incidental, it is essential. Faith cannot be communicated in ethical language. If Abraham were able to explain his action in universal terms, then it would no longer be faith. It would be ethics disguised as religion. Faith, as Kierkegaard understands it, begins precisely where explanation fails. This is why Kierkegaard distinguishes Abraham from tragic heroes. A tragic hero like Agamemnon sacrifices something precious for the sake of the universal, the good of the state, the demands of duty, the preservation of order. His action is terrible, but intelligible. He can explain himself, he can be justified. Abraham cannot, he sacrifices the universal itself. He is willing to kill his son, not for the sake of a higher ethical good, but in obedience to a command that cannot be justified ethically at all. Kierkegaard insists that this places Abraham outside ethics, not beneath it. This is the scandal of faith. Faith does not refine ethics, it does not complete it, it collides with it. And yet Kierkegaard does not allow us to dismiss Abraham as insane or immoral. He insists that Abraham's faith is genuine precisely because it cannot be defended. This creates a profound problem. If faith cannot be justified ethically, then how can it be distinguished from fanaticism? If the individual can appeal directly to God, what prevents moral chaos? Kierkegaard does not evade these questions. He intensifies them. Fear and Trembling is not a manual for belief. It is a test. It tests whether we are willing to take faith seriously, not as comfort, tradition, or morality, but as a relation that places the individual alone before the absolute. It forces us to confront the possibility that genuine faith may be ethically incomprehensible. Kierkegaard does not tell us to become Abraham. He tells us to recognize what Abraham represents. Abraham stands at the limit of human understanding. He exposes the tension between ethics and faith that cannot be resolved without destroying one or the other. Fear and Trembling does not resolve this tension. It insists that we face it without retreat. This is why the book is called Fear and Trembling, not because faith is reassuring, but because it demands everything and offers no explanation in return. Kierkegaard deepens the problem of fear and trembling by insisting that Abraham's situation cannot be understood psychologically, ethically, or socially. Any attempt to reduce Abraham's act to motive, character, or outcome misses the point entirely. What matters is not why Abraham acts, but how he stands in relation to the absolute. This is why Kierkegaard rejects every attempt to explain Abraham away. Abraham is not acting out of cruelty, madness, or calculation. He does not misunderstand the command. He does not believe Isaac will be spared in some obvious way. Kierkegaard insists that Abraham fully understands what is being demanded of him, and that is precisely what makes his faith extraordinary. Faith, in this sense, is not certainty, it is risk. Abraham does not possess evidence, justification, or reassurance. He stands in absolute uncertainty, yet acts without despair. Kierkegaard describes this posture as infinite resignation combined with faith. Abraham gives up what he loves most, and yet believes, absurdly, that he will receive it back. This belief is not rational. It is not a calculation of probabilities. It is not optimism. Kierkegaard calls it belief by virtue of the absurd. The absurd is not nonsense, it is the collision between human reason and divine demand. Abraham believes what reason cannot support. This distinguishes Abraham from every ethical hero. The ethical hero sacrifices the particular for the universal. Abraham is willing to sacrifice the universal itself. His duty to Isaac, his duty as a father, his duty as a moral being, all are suspended. He obeys a command that cannot be justified within human reason. Kierkegaard insists that this does not make Abraham a tragic figure. Tragedy involves loss that can be understood and shared. Abraham's loss cannot be shared. He cannot speak. He cannot explain himself to Sarah, to Isaac, or to anyone else. If he tried, he would appear monstrous. This silence is essential. Faith isolates the individual absolutely. Ethical life binds individuals together through shared norms. Faith breaks that bond. The individual stands alone, unable to appeal to community, law, or reason. Kierkegaard insists that this loneliness is not a flaw of faith, but its condition. This is why faith inspires fear and trembling, not because it is emotional, but because it removes every safeguard. The individual cannot hide behind universality. They cannot reassure themselves that they are acting rightly in human terms. They act without mediation. Kierkegaard is careful to stress that this situation is rare. He does not suggest that individuals should seek it. Faith, in this sense, is not a general rule. It is an exception that cannot be institutionalized. The moment faith becomes a principle, it collapses back into ethics or fanaticism. This is why Kierkegaard refuses to justify Abraham. Justification would destroy faith. To justify Abraham ethically would turn him into a tragic hero. To justify him psychologically would turn him into a case study. To justify him religiously in a public sense would turn faith into doctrine. Faith cannot be taught, it can only be confronted. Kierkegaard's purpose is not to persuade us that Abraham is right. It is to force us to recognize what faith would have to be if it were taken seriously. Faith is not morality plus belief. It is not ethics with emotion added. It is a relation that exceeds ethical comprehension. This is what makes Fear and Trembling so unsettling. It does not allow us to admire Abraham safely. It does not allow us to imitate him responsibly. It leaves us suspended between admiration and horror. Kierkegaard insists that this discomfort is the point. If faith could be made comfortable, it would no longer be faith. It would be ethics in disguise. Abraham stands as a reminder that faith, if it exists at all, exists at the edge of human understanding. It demands everything, yet cannot be explained. It promises meaning, yet offers no guarantees. To take faith seriously, Kierkegaard insists, is not to make it easier. It is to recognize how dangerous it truly is. Kierkegaard now sharpens the distinction between faith and fanaticism, because without this distinction the argument of fear and trembling collapses into danger. If Abraham's act cannot be ethically justified, then how can it avoid becoming a license for violence? Kierkegaard confronts this question directly by insisting on how narrow and demanding true faith actually is. Faith is not enthusiasm. It is not intensity, conviction, or emotional certainty. A fanatic is loud, confident, and eager to justify themselves. Abraham is silent, inward, and unable to justify anything at all. Kierkegaard insists that this inability is decisive. The fanatic wants recognition. They want their action to be seen, validated, and affirmed. Faith, by contrast, cannot seek recognition. The moment the individual demands validation, they have already returned to the ethical or social sphere. Faith exists only where justification is impossible. This is why Abraham cannot speak. If Abraham tried to explain himself, he would betray faith. Explanation would require universal categories. It would turn faith into ethics or into madness. Abraham remains silent, not because he lacks words, but because no words could preserve the meaning of his act. Kierkegaard insists that this silence is terrifying. It leaves the individual without protection. No one can confirm that Abraham is right. No institution can certify him. No doctrine can guarantee that he is not deceived. Faith offers no safety net. This is why faith cannot be generalized. If someone claims to act in faith and demands that others accept their claim, they are no longer acting in faith. They are demanding ethical recognition. Faith does not compel others. It isolates the individual absolutely. Kierkegaard draws a sharp contrast here. The fanatic wants followers. The believer wants obedience to God alone. The fanatic explains. The believer remains silent. The fanatic seeks certainty. The believer acts in uncertainty. This difference is not superficial. It determines whether the individual has left ethics behind or merely distorted it. Kierkegaard insists that faith is inseparable from fear and trembling precisely because there is no guarantee that one is not mistaken. Faith does not provide psychological comfort. It produces anxiety, dread, and isolation. The believer cannot be sure of anything except their responsibility before God. This is why Kierkegaard rejects any attempt to turn faith into a system. A system promises clarity, rules, and predictability. Faith destroys all three. It cannot be taught, transmitted, or institutionalized. It can only be lived, and even then, it cannot be made secure. This makes faith deeply uncomfortable for modern minds. Modernity seeks transparency, justification, and accountability. Faith offers none of these in human terms. It demands obedience without explanation and commitment without reassurance. Kierkegaard insists that if this seems unacceptable, then we must admit that we do not want faith. We want ethics with religious language. Fear and Trembling forces this admission. It strips away sentimental religion and confronts us with the possibility that genuine faith may be ethically unintelligible. Kierkegaard does not tell us to accept this possibility easily. He insists that it should trouble us deeply. If faith were safe, it would not require fear and trembling. If faith were explainable, it would not be faith. Abraham stands not as an example to imitate, but as a limit case that exposes what faith would have to be if it existed at all. Kierkegaard insists that this exposure is the book's true purpose. Faith is not a supplement to ethics, it is a rupture. And that rupture cannot be domesticated without destroying what it claims to be. Kierkegaard now introduces one of the most important clarifications in Fear and Trembling. Abraham's act cannot be understood as a rejection of ethics, but as a suspension of it for the sake of a higher relation. This distinction matters, because without it, the entire argument collapses into nihilism. Ethics, for Kierkegaard, is not false. It is universal, binding, and necessary for human life. Ethical obligations structure relationships, responsibility, and community. Without ethics, there would be no shared world at all. Abraham fully understands this. His willingness to sacrifice Isaac is therefore not ignorance of ethics, but obedience despite it. This is what makes Abraham's situation so severe. He does not abandon ethics casually. He does not believe that ethics no longer applies to him. He experiences the full weight of ethical responsibility and acts anyway. The pain of his obedience arises precisely because he knows what he is doing. Kierkegaard insists that this pain is essential. If Abraham felt no ethical conflict, he would not be a figure of faith, but of indifference. Faith does not erase ethical awareness. It intensifies it. Abraham's suffering lies in holding both together, ethical obligation and absolute obedience, without resolution. This is why Kierkegaard describes Abraham as greater than the tragic hero. The tragic hero sacrifices something precious for the sake of the universal. His suffering is real but meaningful within ethical terms. Abraham sacrifices the universal itself. His suffering cannot be redeemed ethically. There is no audience that can understand him, no principle that can justify him. This isolation defines Abraham's greatness. He stands alone, not because he rejects others, but because no one can stand with him. Faith places him in a relation that cannot be shared. Kierkegaard insists that this solitude is not accidental, it is the condition of absolute faith. At the same time, Kierkegaard is adamant that this does not license ethical chaos. The teleological suspension of the ethical applies only in the rare case where the individual stands in absolute relation to the absolute. It cannot be invoked as a rule. It cannot be claimed publicly. The moment it is generalized, it becomes indistinguishable from fanaticism. This is why Kierkegaard repeatedly insists on inwardness. Faith is inward, silent, and unobservable. It cannot be verified by outward behavior alone. From the outside, Abraham looks indistinguishable from a murderer. Only inward relation distinguishes him, and that relation cannot be inspected or certified. This makes faith terrifying. It removes all external criteria. There is no checklist, no proof, no guarantee. The individual stands exposed before God without mediation. Kierkegaard insists that this exposure is not a privilege, but a burden. Modern readers often want to soften this burden. They want to reinterpret Fear and Trembling as a metaphor, a psychological drama, or a symbolic lesson about trust. Kierkegaard resists all such interpretations. He insists that faith must be taken literally or not at all. If faith is reduced to metaphor, it becomes harmless. But Kierkegaard did not write Fear and Trembling to be harmless. He wrote it to confront complacent religiosity, with the possibility that genuine faith is ethically incomprehensible and existentially demanding. This confrontation is not meant to comfort, it is meant to disturb. Kierkegaard does not resolve the tension between ethics and faith. He insists that it cannot be resolved without destroying one or the other. The task of the reader is not to solve the problem, but to recognize its seriousness. Abraham remains suspended. He is neither justified nor condemned. He stands at the limit of human understanding. Kierkegaard leaves him there deliberately, refusing to provide closure. This refusal is itself an ethical act. It prevents faith from being turned into a doctrine, a justification, or a weapon. It preserves faith's danger by denying it resolution. In this way, Fear and Trembling does not explain faith, it exposes it. And what it exposes is not reassuring, it is terrifying. Kierkegaard closes Fear and Trembling by refusing every attempt to make faith safe. He does not resolve the paradox Abraham represents, and he does not offer guidance for how one might act in a similar situation. This refusal is deliberate. Faith, if it exists at all, cannot be reduced to instruction. The danger of misunderstanding Fear and Trembling lies precisely here. Readers often want to extract a lesson, a principle that could be applied ethically or psychologically. Kierkegaard insists that this impulse betrays the text. The moment faith becomes a lesson, it becomes ethical again. Faith collapses back into universality and loses what makes it distinct. This is why Abraham cannot be imitated. Kierkegaard insists that Abraham is not an example to follow, but a limit case. He represents what faith would have to be if it were absolute. The point is not to become Abraham, but to recognize how far faith stands from everyday moral life. This recognition has consequences. It exposes how much modern religiosity depends on ethical comfort. People want faith to support morality, social order, and psychological well-being. Kierkegaard insists that this desire misunderstands faith entirely. Faith does not stabilize ethics, it destabilizes it. This does not mean that faith promotes immorality. Kierkegaard is clear that ethical life remains binding for human beings in general. Abraham's situation does not abolish ethics for others. Faith does not create a new moral law. It suspends ethics only in the singular, unrepeatable case of absolute relation. This singularity is crucial. Faith cannot be shared, transferred, or institutionalized. It belongs to the individual alone. The believer cannot demand that others understand or accept their obedience. They must bear the burden of misunderstanding without protest. Kierkegaard insists that this burden is inseparable from faith. If faith offered reassurance, clarity, or recognition, it would no longer be faith. It would be a form of ethical heroism or moral confidence. Faith, by contrast, involves obedience without justification and commitment without explanation. This is why Kierkegaard describes faith as a double movement. The believer gives up what they love most through infinite resignation, and yet believes they will receive it back through faith. This belief is not rational hope. It is trust in the absurd. Trust that what reason declares impossible will nonetheless be restored. Abraham does not know how Isaac will be spared. He does not believe in a general rule that sacrifices are rewarded. He acts without understanding and without guarantee. Kierkegaard insists that this is the essence of faith. Faith does not cancel suffering, it intensifies it. The believer experiences the full weight of loss and the full uncertainty of obedience at the same time. Faith is not an escape from despair, but a way of standing within it without collapse. This is why Fear and Trembling remains so disturbing. It does not allow faith to become moral reassurance or psychological comfort. It presents faith as an existential ordeal that cannot be defended, explained, or justified in human terms. Kierkegaard leaves the reader without resolution. He does not tell us whether Abraham is right or wrong. He does not tell us whether faith is desirable or dangerous. He insists only that if faith exists, it exists as something that cannot be mediated by ethics. This insistence forces a final question. Do we want faith at this cost? If the answer is no, Kierkegaard insists that we should be honest about it. We should not soften faith into metaphor or morality. We should admit that what we want is ethical life, not faith. If the answer is yes, then we must accept fear and trembling as inseparable from belief. There is no faith without risk. There is no faith without isolation. There is no faith without the suspension of explanation. Fear and trembling does not tell us how to live. It tells us how dangerous faith would be if it were real. And it leaves us standing, like Abraham, without answers.